So just to give you a little bit, I think we've talked a little bit about what this program's been about. We're on this 30-day flow challenge.
Yeah.
Week one was about presence. And so last week we had on our Friday flow session was about mindfulness and some meditation practice. This week is about connect. And so we thought it was great to have you to talk about the mind-body connection. And really a question I had for you was, there's a lot of talk about embodied cognition, which is what you're talking about, but there's also the term interoception. Are they the same or are they different? And could you explain kind of the difference between the two?
Between interoception and...
Is there a difference? Because I hear it sometimes used in the same sentence as it's the same thing, but I think there's probably some subtle differences between embodied cognition. So define that.
Oh.
And then is it the same as interoception, or is interoception a part of embodied cognition? Yep.
Good. No, they're not the same thing. And also, just to go back on your concept of connect and connection, there is also this mind-body connection, and I'll explain that in a second. Embodied cognition really takes away the word connect. The mind is not connected to the body. They're not separate things. That's what embodied cognition really points at. And there's a lot of empirical evidence now from neuroscience to back that theoretical and philosophical framework up. Okay, so, well, let me just say this first, because also there's this connection to other people. And not only the connection to, right, so that's called social cognition. I'm hearing a little bit of an echo. Yeah, there it goes. It went away. Good. And so so there's this connection between the mind and the body, which we have traditionally thought of, but then there's also a connection that we have to other brains or other people. And embodied cognition takes away the word connection. Now I know this, I don't want to sound counterintuitive, right? But the reason why that happens is because traditionally we think of in terms of dualism, like that there's two things, right? There's this physical body, and maybe even like three things, spirit. I'm going to leave that out for now, just because it brings into a lot of other belief systems and viewpoints, and I just want to leave that aside for now. But the connection between the mind and body implies that there's two different things. Like there's this physical body, and then there's this mental thing, right? The physical thing and then the mental thing, and somehow those are connected. That's the mind-body problem. And embodied cognition solves that problem. It's one of the answers to that problem. And it turns out that it takes away those connections. The mind is the body. We can't think of those two things as really separate things. And we now know that this is the definition of embodied cognition, that the body and the way it interacts with the environment and moves around and gestures and things like this affect and play a key role in cognition and in all these cognitive processes like attention. That's why it has a lot to do with peak performance and flow, because flow follows focus, right? It drives attention into the now. Perception, the way we perceive the world, language, emotional regulation, memory, learning, all of these cognitive processes that we normally think of here in the mind as mental things, they're really things that we have to consider in terms of in the context of the body and how it moves around. Does that make sense?
Yeah. There's a question here that says, so there is a symbiotic relation between the mind and the body. Will you say yes to that then?
So
there's kind of a nuance between mind and body if you say symbiotic. So we were just saying it just is.
It just is. And that's great. So I would say, a relationship implies a connection. So here's the way I define the mind. This comes from, and I'll get to this question, the relationship thing with this definition. So in my TEDx talk, right, I talk about the mind is a relational process, but it's not a relational process between some mental thing in our heads and the body. It's a relational process between the body and its environment.
Right.
Okay. That's so movement becomes primary, and cognition, emotional regulation, all these things become secondary. And this is in terms of an evolutionary, it's in the context of an evolutionary answer, but also just in terms of the developmental process. So let me give you an example so one of the fields of embodied cognition comes from a developmental perspective, and that is from when we're children. and how we explore the world and grab things and make things like a pencil you can see in my hand and a computer. We create the world around us to shape our bodies. J.J. Gibson called these things affordances. The objects that we see in our environment, like even from our ancestors, like rocks and things like that, he didn't see them. He said the mind doesn't see them as objects separate from us. He sees that we see those objects as opportunities to interact with. And he called them, they afford us opportunities. And so that really shows that there's no connection between the mind and the body, right? I don't know if I went off a little of a tangent there, but so the way I define the mind is a self-organized, emergent process that happens because of embodiment. It's an embodied process that happens because of movement and this relationship, not between the mind and the body, but between the body and the external world. Now that really has a lot of import into peak performance and how we can maximize our potential, our mental potential. And a lot of studies are now showing that. So that is separate from interoception. Okay, interoception, to get to this original question, is distinct from embodied cognition, but is evidence for embodied cognition. Okay, interoception is the sense of what's going on inside our bodies, but not only inside our bodies, but it's how our bodies move, which is proprioception. Or there's also another word called visceroception, visceroception, which is what's going on and feeling the signals that are coming from our body. And we now know, and this is why interoception is evidence for the framework of embodied cognition. We now know that interoception, this sense of what's going on in our bodies and how our bodies are moving and the signals that we're receiving from our viscera, from our skin. We now know that interoception has a direct effect on cognitive processes. Okay, so for example, feeling your own heartbeat. I always give this example. Feeling your own heartbeat, like I just had an itch on me, right? Like that's, some people have less sense of the itches on their body, and some people are really sensitive to those, right? And so feeling your own heartbeat, actually being more sensitive to your heartbeat has an effect on cognition, on the way your brain perceives and attends and all these kinds of things. That's because, let me get my little brain model out, my trusty brain model. That's because, my good friends, a lot of the brain parts that are involved in perception are also involved in motor output. They're the same brain areas, the same brain networks, if that makes sense. We used to think of those things as distinct. We now have evidence, thanks to great scientists like Antonio Dimaggio, Richter Craig, all of these people, that motor processes and cognitive processes are very interrelated.
Well,
Motor process, yeah.
When you say that, I remember I was part of a reading recovery program where we actually had kids crawling around to help them with their reading retention. So there is that kinesiology kind of stuff, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is why the Montessori model of education works so well, because it's embodied education. Mm-hmm. It's education by exploring the world, using your body, focusing on your breath, all of these kinds of things. We now know that they have such an effect on cognitive processes like learning and memory and attention. And this paper, can I share my screen actually?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, let me just show everybody this paper. I'm so excited about this paper. I just sent it to you guys.
Put on your seatbelts, everybody. Here we go.
All right, here, get ready, people. This is science. Science translated to peak performance. That's what this is.
Just so you know, Michael, we're using the term optimal performance because, again, it's about what is the next best step for us. And I think a lot of times, you know, I think a lot of times we use peak performance. People are like, well, I'm not a high performing athlete or whatever. And so we were really kind of cognizant about saying, it's about optimal. Like, how do we get to the optimal? And how do we use this awareness to kind of bring ourselves into the moment so we could know what the next best step is, right? So I think we all want to be at a peak or a flow state, which is feeling our best or performing our best. But, you know, how does this understanding help people to do the next best thing, that level of awareness?
You see, what I love that. I love that. I would piggyback on that and saying, and I'll share my screen in a second. It's the difference between subjective and objective, right? the subjective meaning, what's my optimal state? And the way I think of peak is like the peak is of all humanity, right? Like Alex Honnold free soloing El Capitan. That's like the peak of humanity versus what's my peak, right? It's like asking this question, what is the meaning of life, or what is a meaning of life? Those are two different questions, right? From a philosophical point of view. So I think what you're saying is that optimal is like what, you know, it's not the peak, but it's just like what's optimal for each individual.
Right. Especially if the world is crumbling around them, like what's the next best step for me? How do I gain a sense of, self and control of my mind, body, that interplay, knowing that what I'm feeling right now is giving me information where I should do something with it. So what is that next best step? So that awareness.
Yeah. I like that. Yeah, I like that. It's self-optimization, right? And what's the next best step for me? How do I optimize myself, and how do I get to that road? Yeah. I like that.
And so we've been giving a practice around breath work and nutrition and movement and things like that, so that we are developing that as a practice, knowing that interplay between body, mind has a significant role in the way we show up, not only with ourselves in situations, but with others as well. So if our nervous systems are talking with each other, it would be nice to know that we have our shit together, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
So what are you excited about?
Can you see my screen? Which one? The paper?
Yep.
Okay. Let me put you guys on here. No, and just because I was saying something that made me think of a quote that I just highlighted in this paper that I want. It's a very short paper. I'm going to highly recommend this. I could put it in the chat if you guys want.
Yep.
But you see here, let me just read the conclusion of the paper. Let's start from the end, and then we can go to the beginning. And this is really relevant to this idea of optimal performance, right? And optimizing our next step. And what can we do in that? And why does embodied cognition have such import and relevance to that? So the interoception refers to the perception of the internal body states. I'm just going to read here, and then I have a couple slides to show you as well. Playing an important role in the mental representation of the self. In this paper, we demonstrated that interoception, which we've already defined, can influence social cognition. That is, the body can influence the individual's social cognition through interoception. This is phenomenal. This is amazing. Studies have shown that a tendency to focus on one's own internal experiences or to conduct experimental self-observation, such as looking at oneself in the mirror and gazing at a self-photograph and looking at self-relevant words, can improve the accuracy of heartbeat perception. So that is very solid empirical evidence, right, that self-observation, right, and interoception improves our social cognition. And actually, Darwin had an idea about this with the vagus nerve. He said that the activity of the vagus nerve, which upregulates the parasympathetic nervous system, our rest and digest system, lets us recognize emotional states in ourselves and in other people, especially through their faces, their facial expressions. And we actually, a study just came out 2 years ago showing that was actually true. And he proposed that.
Is that Stephen Porges' work?
Yes, the polyvagal theory. That's exactly right. Yep. So the polyvagal theory is a overarching theoretical framework that explains all of these observations that we're finding.
So bring it down to Joe on the street. So what are you saying, Michael?
Okay. So what I'm saying is that, and they actually put it in this paper really nicely. We suggest that improving the sensitivity or accuracy of interoception can enhance one's ability to understand the mental states of others, thereby enabling better social communication. So that's the connection to other people. So here's what I'm saying to Joe on the street, to answer your question, is that the body has an effect on cognition and the way we perceive the external world. One of the evidences of that is to increase our levels of interoception. So we need to focus on our own bodies, how they move, what's going on inside them, conscious breathing, the way our faces feel, all of these kinds of things, the signals that we're getting from our heartbeats. And if we can increase that sensitivity to our own, increase that awareness of our own body states when we feel hungry. So if you can catch your hunger right when it happens, right? Or know when you're thirsty, for example, when you're reaching for the bottle, if you can increase that awareness through things like meditation, mindfulness, conscious breathing, yoga, mindful movement, if all of these things increase that, if you can increase that, that's going to have a direct effect on the way you perceive the external world, your relationships with your family, your loved ones, and your own performance, your own optimization. That's what I'm saying. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Any questions out there? We have some questions coming in. I want to see if we have.
We do. I can field a few of these questions. Michael,
So,
good to see you, buddy. How you been?
Good to see you, my friend.
Yeah.
Always good to see you, man, and hear your voice.
Yeah. So I love the circling around this as a topic. A couple of questions. Number one is there a relationship between what you're speaking about right now and heart math as a concept?
Good. Well, I was having a great conversation about heart math just earlier this morning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they really deal with heart rate coherence, right? Which is, let me see how to break this up. So that's coherence between, and I'll explain what coherence means in a second. That's coherence between the heartbeat and the breath and the respiration, right? And there's a coherence in this, and the brain as well. And so there's something called heartbeat evoked potentials. You can put a EEG cap on a person and measure their brain activity, and there's a certain wave that you can detect that synchronizes with your heartbeat. And that's what we mean by coherence. Coherence is a correlation. It's a synchronization between your heartbeat, right, and your breath and your brain wave activity, if that sort of makes sense. And it's in the frequency band. It's not in the time domain. It's in frequencies, because there's different brain waves. They come in different frequencies, like alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. And those different frequencies subserve different cognitive functions. And so coherence is a measure of it's a correlation between the frequency of this activity and the frequency of your heartbeat. Mm-hmm. Your heart rate variability, I should say, actually, which is different. And so that's it does have a direct connection to what they're doing. I don't know if I answered your question, but
yeah. Well, and one thing that we do here in terms of breath practice is we do a 5-5-6. So like we're breathing in for 5, breathing out for 5, and we do that 6 times. With this in mind, that we're trying to become more coherent of. And I like the way you explain that feels, a little bit more in depth than maybe the way we had unpacked it originally. Couple other things go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, I was just going to say, you go.
Question about cognition, and like when you just mentioned that on the social cognition point, that one of our attendees here is mentioning that would that relate with sport athletes that are more team versus individual?
Oh my right? God, what a great question. What a great question.
Because they have to be in sync with one another all the time, right?
So my answer to that is...
Or work teams, you can...
Or a work team,
Work teams. I mean, I see medical professionals that can get in sync really quickly because they have some clarity. So I think it's, we have the sports paradigm, but there's also, I think, just the work team paradigm as well.
Right.
Yeah, any kind of like team to get into this group flow states, especially maybe even now in the new normal virtual environment, which is a different thing, I think. Obviously very, very related. So in terms of teams, and in a sports environment or in, let's say, an organizational environment, that matters, right? That matters. Synchronizing breaths, synchronizing even brainwave activity, which you can measure, synchronizing these kinds of things in your own body, foster what's called this theory of mind. They talk about it in this paper as well, and that is there's certain parts of your brain that understand that other people are understanding. Mm-hmm. There's certain parts of your brain that understand that other people, like you're nodding your head, I see this, I'm getting immediate feedback from you, and these kinds of things. And there's parts of their brain that light up because I understand that you also have mental states. You also have goals. You also have wishes and desires and these kinds of things. And you can train those brain networks and those parts of the brain with these kinds of things, which then facilitate and foster group flow and team collaborations and enhanced collaborations and these kinds of things. So breath work is one way to do that. There's a bunch of other physiological data points that you can actually use to keep track of that as well. Even heart rate variability, right? So there's this global consciousness project that's going on right now. I think that's from the people at Heart.
I think that's Heart Math, yeah.
Math as well, yeah. I could send you a couple links on that, where they're synchronizing people with like heart rate variability as well, and that's tricky because you need the algorithms to measure heart rate variability, and then those algorithms need to be compared to like track and coordinate other people's, the connection between other people's heart rate variabilities as well. So that's a really great question, and my answer to that is yes. And there's a rich literature supporting that question and the yes answer to that question. And I could point you to some of that, but awesome. I'm just thinking about other,
Well, I can also see it related to like how fans can have an impact on performance then too, because you felt like shifts, like you feel like the momentum shifting, and you can feel all the people in the stands either getting excited or anxious, and you see how the performance of the athletes start to shift on the field just because the impact of the people observing the performers has an impact in terms of, and it's really, I've always wanted to do a study of like measuring like mood of the crowd with the performance of the teams on the field, because I do think there's something there.
That's brilliant. There is something there. And my interest would be to finding what's the underlying neurobiological mechanisms at play, because there are. We have to look at this in different levels. That's what complex systems is all about. So there are properties and relations between the team and the audience, right? And not only that, but even in organizations, right? Between the risk or the success that the team is going to have, or failure that the team is going to have, and that's going to have ramifications or implications for the rest of the organization.
Right.
So rather than a spatial relationship between the fans and the crowd and the team, there's a temporal relationship between the team and an organization, and how that's going to affect the rest of the organization over time, over the future. And so I know that there's evidence about this. There's some research on this as well. I've come across it actually. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but yeah, your hypothesis is spot on.
So we have Catherine who is asking about VR training. And she's making the point that she can see how, using VR to, say, for example, train someone who's going to potentially learn a dangerous skill at work or something like that, and how that, manifests within their bodies as they are, walking out on that beam or doing whatever the dangerous thing, whatever the situation that they're trying to train. Talk a little bit about how, AI, and specifically in this case, VR, can play a role in our ability to become more adept in more of an interoceptive way.
Okay.
And do you see the value in VR? Obviously, it's a big, hit these days, and I think people are starting to become more buzzed around using VR training. What does it look like through the lens of neuroscience?
I have a slide on this. Can I show my slide on this?
Absolutely.
All right, cool.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I have to find I have to find my slide on this though. I have a great slide on this, people. This is a great question. I actually have a prepared slide, but I have to find where it is because I don't know if it's in this presentation or not.
While you're looking
here it is. Here it is. I got it.
Okay.
I got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me. Okay. You can see my screen? Yeah?
Yep.
Okay. So there is lots of studies going on now in terms of how VR is having relevance for embodied cognition, number one, interoception, social cognition, understanding the self and understanding how to innovate, for example, and increase empathy. There's a great study out of Stanford, which I think we talked about before. It's kind of well known now, though. You're homeless for a day. It's the VR lab at Stanford. It's increasing empathy. So VR is being used a lot to do this. The reason why VR works is because it fools the brain with this bottom-up information. Okay, So here's, I want to make it.
Stop right there. So could you describe
Yep.
what you mean by bottom up and top down? Because
That's exactly what I was just going to go. Yeah. So there's a distinction between bottom up information and top down. All right. Bottom up information is this information coming in from the your senses, the external world, right? You're touching things, you're seeing things. That bottom up information is having an effect on physiological processes, your cognitive processes, all these kinds of things. Top down, so let's take perception. Perception is a cognitive process. What is perception? Perception is the interpretation and organization of the incoming information, right? Your perception controls the way you perceive, your brain controls the way you perceive, your body and your brain, embodied cognition, the way you perceive that sensory information, okay? Your perception is not a passive process. It's an active process. The brain doesn't record reality like a one-to-one correlation between, like a camera, right? I always give that example. It does not record information like a camera. It actively constructs the external world, and it has an effect. Those top-down processes, like your culture, what language you speak, what your belief systems are, what your previous knowledge is. All of those things, those top-down processes have an effect on the way that you interpret that sensory information coming in. Now, there's two really good examples of this. One is called the rubber hand illusion. The second one is called the body transfer illusion. And this is used in VR. This is being used in VR. So let me explain this really quickly. Well, I'll try and be really quick. So the rubber hand illusion is an illusion. You could just type in Google and look at this. This is a great example of embodied cognition, right? Where you put your hands on the desk out in front of you, and you could see here, there's something blocking. Well, this is not actually a good picture of it, but let me give you a good picture of it here. You can see my screen. I'll just go over here. Rubber hand illusion. Just give you a visual is just better. Okay. Yeah. So let's look at this. Let's look at this picture here. So you see this picture here?
Yep.
Right. So there's a rubber hand. The person can see the rubber hand, but they cannot see the real hand because there's a blockage. The experimenter rubs these paintbrushes on the real hand, synchronizing with the rubbing a paintbrush on the rubber hand. So the person can feel the paintbrush on their real hand. They can't feel it on the rubber hand because it's rubber, but they can see it on the rubber hand. So you have this conflicting bottom-up sensory information coming in. And it turns out that the person's brain, because the brain creates a model of the body, can actually override this top-down, can actually override this bottom-up, and the person can adopt the rubber hand as their own. So much so that you can actually stick a fork in the rubber hand, and there's brain areas that light up, which have been tested, that feel pain. So that's a good example. The rubber hand illusion is a good example of embodied cognition. And this has actually been extended to the entire body using virtual reality. And this is the point that I wanted to get at. So you see here, okay, this was a very well-known study, first-person experience of a body transfer illusion in virtual reality. So this is one example, Damon, to this question that was asked on how virtual reality is being used to show embodied cognition and show that you can literally feel like you're in somebody else's body. You can literally have this experience where you actually transfer and feel like you own somebody else's body. And this is true. Like there's a disorder called somatic paraphrenia where people feel like their limbs don't belong to them anymore because of these areas of the brain are lesioned or something like this. Not only can this be used to make you feel like you have another body, but can also affect cognitive processes like creativity, innovation, overcoming fear. So increasing empathy, the thing that I mentioned at Stanford. So virtual reality is being used to manipulate this top-down versus bottom-up to do all kinds of weird things, increase cognition, bring subnormal brains to normal, as I was saying. There's all of this evidence does that make sense? what I'm saying here? There's all of this evidence to support that question. Yes. And that's just one example.
Yeah. Well, I just go on so many different rabbit holes in my own head as you're talking about the implications of this. And I
Sure.
guess, to kind of think about, again, this is people on the street trying to work on this idea of getting into flow. What are some practices that you have found useful to help people kind of, again, no longer see the brain and body as separate, but to kind of notice, like you said, practices, simple little things that they could do to kind of be aware of that self, the self being brain and body. It's the same thing at the same time.
Yeah. Take that multidimensional assessment of interoceptive awareness. Try and do some exercises to increase your interoceptive awareness. That is feeling your heartbeat. Pay attention in the morning, in the evening, during your routines, what's going on in your body. Just like yoga nidra is a very good kind of thing to do. Conscious breathing, coordinating the breath with movement is a very particular good thing to do, like yoga or Tai Chi, or these kinds of interoceptive exercises have been shown to reduce stress, reduce anxiety. Mindful movement has direct impacts on these kinds of things. Mindful movement coordinated with breath. Those are, rubbing your ears. I always tell people, because this actually, giving yourself a facial massage, this actually changes your vagal tone, which increases your heart rate variability. Back to polyvagal theory, increasing your HRV by stimulating their ears, because the vagus nerve, a branch of the vagus nerve, actually innervates the ear. That's why that works. Actually has an effect on that. Learning different. So I had a slide on this and I didn't show you. Yeah, here it is. So active learning versus passive learning. So a study just came out. I don't know. It just came out maybe a couple years ago, whatever. There's different neural correlates of the ways in which the brain learns. So you want to talk about accelerated learning, right? Which is a foundation of optimal performance and increase and maximizing our physical and mental potential here. They did a really interesting study showing that when you gesture, when you're learning words from a foreign language, you learn those words better. And not only that, they showed that at the level of the brain. So people were just learning words, translating words from a foreign language. Then another group of people were translating foreign words and gesturing, making like any kinds of anchoring, all those kinds of techniques and gesturing. They actually found that second group of people, the brain areas that lit up were actually involved in motor movements when they were translating the words just in their mind. Whereas the first group of people, the brain areas that lit up were only the parts of the brain that were involved in language and just translation. So that shows that combining gesture and movement in this way increases the way you actually learn a language. Another well-known study showed that yoga, which is mindful movement, coordinated with breath, actually affects areas of the brain that are involved with empathy and gesture. So empathy is located in the brain in different parts of the brain. Cognitive empathy is located in different parts of the brain than emotional empathy, like literally putting yourself in virtually putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, versus cognitive empathy, which is just taking their perspective. Not feeling what they're feeling, just taking their perspective. That's the difference between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. And empathy is involved in gestures and understanding that other people, like I said, have these emotional states. And so this study showed that yoga, I think it was yoga versus pure recreational athletes, I forget what they were doing, increased these areas of the brain that were involved in gestures and empathy. If that makes any sense, over and above recreational athletes. So mindful movement, conscious breathing, interoception, all of these different, and there's many ways to do these different practices, many ways, right? So all of these different practices and these categories have all kinds of effects on just for, the Joe on the street trying to optimize and become better, if that makes sense.
That's amazing. It's so cool.
Yeah.
Hey, one thing, Michael, we've had people take is the Maya 2 assessment.
Right.
And so many people in this course, I think 41 have taken it. And I would suggest those of you who haven't taken it to try to take it as well. And this is a way for us to establish a bit of a baseline around how well we know our own body sensations and then how we act upon those. Can you just briefly talk a little bit about Maya and why that assessment is so valid and relevant? And then the other thing we're having people do, and here's one that's really blowing my mind with this group, because this is a group that, let me tell you what, man, this group leans in and they're really going for it. We have
That's
also,
awesome.
Yeah. We've also asked them to do an emotional, essentially an emotional and a body scan. So simply on a day-to-day basis, people are to identify what emotion they feel. And we have a very long list of detailed words to use, and they can choose other as well. And then where in their body they're feeling that.
That is amazing. So yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
So as I'm looking at some of the data right now that's coming out, what strikes me is that people are, on the whole, about 31% of the time, and this is with 606 data samples here. 31% of the time, people are feeling their emotion in their head. So it feels like everything you're talking about, in a sense, is a part of a remedy to kind of get out of your head, you know, and there's a lot around getting out of your head, getting into your body, and that, you know, mindful movement is one of those potential remedies. Is merely doing the survey also part of a practical application that can help people? Because I'm trying to kind of keep people motivated to continue to do this on a day-to-day basis, checking in with themselves. Are we able to become more aware, more sensitive? It sounds like we are, but if you could speak to Maya and that would be awesome.
Well, yeah, so Maya is an empirically tested kind of assessment, and it's not just willy-nilly, right? It's not just like we want, you want to do an emotional body scan and see where you're feeling different emotions in your body. And by the way, that scientist Antonio Damasio distinguishes feelings and emotions. And I want to mention another point that I just thought about in my head. Let me just write it down because it'll go away. So Maya is an empirically tested assessment, and it's not just willy-nilly in the sense of you know, there are very relevant underlying principles and strategies by which to go and do these internal body scans, which is one of the reasons why Yoga Nidra is so successful and you know, so validated, because it's kind of like structured in that way. And so the Maya assessment, it's great. It's a great baseline to get a sense of your interoceptive awareness, and then to be able to, you know, if you have the baseline, then you can do some of these exercises and things like that to then study it and to increase that, right? So, so yeah, that's a very good thing. Let me go back to this other slide I have. I have another slide to show you, if you don't mind. Let me see on that, just that note there. Let me see if I can find it here to get at this question, Damon, that you're asking. Okay, it's in one of my yeah, it's Antonio Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis. I think I've talked to you about this before, which is very relevant here. Let me see if I could find it. Let me see, and then I'll get back to this other point. Here it is. So this is Antonio Damasio. If you could still see my screen. He says there's no such thing as a disembodied mind. The mind is implanted in the body, and the mind is implanted in the brain, and the brain is implanted in the body. Right? There's no such thing as a disembodied mind. You can't separate those two. We talked about this. The mental is the physical. And so this is the multidimensional assessment of interoceptive awareness that I have here on this slide, and it's excellence out of Osher Center for Integrative Medicine. So it's well validated externally. So that's what makes this a really good assessment from a scientific perspective. And then there was this study from Antonio Damasio's team. Interoceptive awareness modulates neural activity during decision-making. So decision-making is a cognitive process. Neural activity happens in the brain. And this is saying that doing this internal body scan has a direct effects on your ability to make decisions. And that's the evidence of this somatic marker hypothesis. So that's a scientific term for what you just said about this internal, you know, emotional body scan, and 31% of the people are feeling this in your head. you said, right? You can train that to feel it in other parts of your body. That's something that you could actually train up. This is the whole idea. The interoception is something that you could train up, and that's important to train up. The somatic marker hypothesis is that the emotional states that we feel in our body affect our decision making and cognitive processes, which is, again, back to this whole notion of embodied cognition. The mental is the physical, right? And so when you're sensing your emotional states in different parts of your body and you're feeling that, when you train this up, you may start to feel, not in your head, but in your hands, in your viscera, in your stomach, in your diaphragm, the movement of your intestines. You may feel it in different parts of your body, and that's because you're training up your levels of interoceptive awareness. Does that make sense?
It does. And
a
question around, are you speaking, a word that we're all familiar with is intuition. And is this essentially training up intuition? And I seem to remember you mentioning a study that was with London bond traders or stock traders around having a higher level of interoception.
Yes,
Does that feed into this as well? This kind of thing?
Yes, absolutely. So intuition is, in my opinion, I should say, intuition is nothing more. We're now studying the underlying mechanisms of intuition. Intuition, in my view, is nothing more than a higher level of sensitivity between what's going on in your body and the brain. That connection, that gut-brain axis, if you will, right, via the vagus nerve. Intuition is nothing more of a heightened sensitivity of that connection and a higher heart rate variability. We get let me see if I can put this. All of this information is coming in our senses, and the brain's number one job is to filter out information. Is to filter out a lot of this information and create up some sort of model that makes sense of all of that information. But there's different ways of knowing. We don't only like logic and we read books or we feel things, right, to get what the external world is like. There's intuition too, that gut feeling, and it's a real thing. It's a heightened sensitivity of your vagus nerve, essentially, and the connection between what's going on in your body, your entire body, not just your viscera, your gut, and your brain. That's what intuition really is. And some people have a much better sense of intuition, either naturally, genetically, like nature, because there's genetic mechanisms by which this connection is heightened. There's ways to learn this and train it up by environment and culture. I think there's really interesting evidence that certain cultures have better intuition than others because of the way they use language or something like this, or the way they listen to music or play music or create music. There's all of these different things affect the way we have access to the external world.
Right. So Michael, you said something earlier, because as you're talking, I'm wondering how trauma plays into this in terms of people's experiences. You're talking about taking maybe underperforming brains and making them, normal states, and then taking them into higher performance. Because, I live in Butte County. We've had, we've had a potential massive flood from a dam breaking. We've had a major fire, and now we're in, this COVID dynamic, and it just compounds the trauma. And Butte County is notorious for just having a lot of trauma in young kids. And I think you came and spoke to some of the folks we had here, and I'm just wondering how do we kind of get people unstuck from maybe trauma using this? Because I brought in some somatic breath work and some other stuff as part of the healing tribe we did in Butte County. So can you speak a little bit about how, if people are kind of stuck, how can they use this to kind of get themselves unstuck? Is that possible?
It is definitely possible, right? Neurons that fire together wire together,
right? But
you can also break that up,
right?
And I forget what the opposite phrase is. There's actually an opposite phrase to that too.
Well, you lose it, right? So that's, it's another one.
But it's like, yeah. But you mentioned it too, the Hebbian learning, right?
Yeah.
Last time we talked, yeah. That's a good question. So, yeah, I would say, the brain is plastic, as we know. There's this notion of neuroplasticity, which that's what learning is. That's what trauma is. These kinds of all of these things, and neuroplasticity is much harder to use as we grow older. I should say there's this notion of cognitive reserve and building up the cognitive reserve, which is the mind's resilience to trauma and change and degeneration, those kinds of things. So I mean, let me think about this. Like, you're asking whether there's ways to.
Well, so for example, I know some of the work I do with Ethan and Human Element in terms of some of our coping strategies we learn at a very young age. So if I was raised and I have abused parents, maybe my strategy is to go run and hide. And so as I grow older, right, I'm in a conflict as an adult, and all of a sudden I just want to run and hide. So it may work for me at the age of 5, but it no longer is really effective for me at the age of 35 when I have people, I need, especially if I'm a leader. And so again, I guess I wanted people to wear, because maybe as we're going through this 30-day challenge, things are coming up for folks,
Right.
And it's completely normal, and it's okay.
Sure.
And we keep talking about the struggle, release, flow, and recovery, that we have to not, we can't be running away from the struggle. It's like really kind of leaning into it and understanding it through kind of this embodied cognition. Like, what is my body telling me right now? And making sense of it. I lost my father-in-law last week on Friday, actually. And I've been really kind of experiencing grief in a very mindful way. And again, as emotions arise, it's like, where is it really coming from? I'm sad for the loss. I'm questioning my own mortality, and I'm grieving that, so there's just a number of different reasons of these emotions coming up for me, and making sense of it. Not that I want to suppress it, I'm letting it out. And it's been really a beautiful experience. So the reason why I asked that question is just for those of us who are experiencing the 30-day challenge, what can they do to maybe get unstuck if they're stressed and they're kind of in these patterns? How can this awareness be kind of a pattern interrupt and finding new habits or new things, new strategies through movement, that's why strategy.
I mean, flow in that sense, right? Flow is the opposite of PTSD. It's on the opposite end of the spectrum of trauma, right?
It's
they're
the
opposite. It's the inversion. And I think neuroscientifically, the mechanisms are almost exactly inverted as well. That's my suspicion or my hypothesis, although I don't know if that's been proven yet. But so there's there's a lot of different therapies, and I'm not a psychologist or a clinician by any sense of the word, like exposure therapy. The brain makes associations. That's what the amygdala does. And to break up those associations, I think, back to the whole point of this talk here, is that embodied cognition and focusing on the body and the way the body moves during when you're grieving, for example, will have an effect on your perception and your emotional regulation and all of those kinds of things. So from my perspective, if you're asking me about what recommendations do I have to make for people with trauma or traumatic experiences or PTSD, is to go back into the body, and increase your levels of interoceptive awareness and pay attention to what's going on in your body when you're thinking about those things, and break up those associations in the amygdala through this notion of embodied cognition, this embodied mind, right? It's at the foundation of everything that goes on in our brains. And when you've had traumatic experiences or PTSD, you've made new connections. Those neurons fired together, right? In a very real and relevant way. There are mechanisms at place to heal trauma and alleviate stress, anxiety, and PTSD by going inside the body. Let me give you a great example. I don't want to go too off topic, but this is a great example of what I wanted to say that I wrote down. So there's this idea of, can I say this real quick, or you look like you want to? Okay.
No, go.
So this is one. This is sort of my hypothesis, but Joe Ledoux, one of my favorite neuroscientists and friend, wrote a book called The Synaptic Self, which I read from you before, and wrote a book called Anxious about trauma and PTSD. This is The Synaptic Self, but he also wrote a book called Anxious, and he talks about the James-Lange theory of emotion. I don't know if you're familiar with the James-Lange theory of emotion, but the idea is that William James, one of my favorite philosophers, famously asked the question, and I think Damon and I, we talked about this before, right? Do we run when we see a bear in the woods? Do we run because we're afraid, or we are afraid because we run? When we strike somebody out of anger, do we strike because we're angry, or are we angry because we strike? And he and this has been well tested now, and this is now shown to be true at the level of the brain in neuroscience and psychology, said that it's the latter, not the former. That is, we don't strike because we're angry. We're angry because we strike. The physiological things happen first, and then the fear and anxiety and trauma, those emotional states are come because of the way the brain interprets the body and those physiological things. So we don't run because we're afraid. We're afraid because we run, right? Like, so, you know, we don't like, oh my God, we're afraid, we run. No. The running happens first, and then you feel afraid because all of these changes, the fight, flight, or freeze response is happening in your body. And so it's a very counterintuitive thing, right? And that's why, like, your reaction just proved that, right? It's a very, very counterintuitive thing. James proposed this back in the 1800s, the late 19th century, and then it's been proved to be true. So if that's the case, if that is true, if emotions happen because there are interpretations of these physiological things going on in our body, the fight, flight, or freeze, that's the output of the amygdala, right? The output of the amygdalas to these emotional systems like the hypothalamus and all of these systems that happen. If that is true, then it might imply that increasing our levels of interoceptive awareness and being able to calm that fight, flight, or response before we feel the emotion might not make the emotion so powerful and bad. And that will have an effect on trauma. This is why, and PTSD, this is why, in my view, interoceptive, and this is all founded upon this notion of embodied cognition. This is why increasing your levels of interoceptive awareness and mindful movement and conscious breathing and all those kinds of things will calm the amygdala and not even give it a chance to send those signals to the fight, flight, or freeze response. Therefore, the brain won't be able to interpret these bad things, these physiological changes happening in your body. Does that make sense? And then the trauma might be less, or the emotions might be less. Does that make sense?
I'm feeling it in my toes right now, man.
All right, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about. So the James-Lange theory of emotion, it's well-founded now. And Joe Ledoux wrote a great book called Anxious that really explains this.
Yeah, and Michael, I want to bring it down to something that Damon shared in our onboarding, and we share an image of Thich Nhat Hanh, and he talks about, you know, being calm on the boat where everyone's, and again, I just think from how I'm interpreting this and in processing this for myself is the reason why, if I can really be, you know, aware and of my body, and I can calm myself, going back to your earlier observation around how our nervous systems are talking to other people's nervous systems, by being calm in the storm, then again, and I think about it as it relates to those who live in Chico, you know, it takes a community to heal, you know, it takes us, all of us. And so if we can all be kind of grounded and in flow and aware of this stuff, then how I show up can have a huge impact and a ripple effect for my team, my community, my family. And so that's how I interpret a lot of this data. So
absolutely. Like if you have lower heart rate, if you have lower heart rate variability, and I'll show my screen again, you're gonna have less of social cognition, less social interactions, less your own you're not going to be able to recognize emotional states in other people's faces. Whereas if you have increased vagal tone and higher heart rate variability and these kinds of things, that's polyvagal theory of Porges. It increases pro-social behaviors. Let me show you the slide. Here's the polyvagal theory. I have the slide here, but I'll show you. Where's my slide that I always have on this stuff? Let me see. It's in this one, I think. Let me just show you this slide here.
Just for people timing us, we'll probably go another 5. How's that sound?
Yeah, another 5.
I can go down this rabbit hole with you all day long. I love this.
let me just. Here's Joe Ledoux's book. Let me show you. There's that study there. Oh, where's my slide? Here it is. It's coming up soon, I think. Yes. So look at this. The activity of the vagus nerve, heart rate variability. So back to heart rate variability. Since inhibitory effects of the vagal branch, the ventral vagal branch, of the vagus nerve allow for a wide range of adaptive pro-social behaviors, going back to your Chico example, right? It has been theorized that individuals with greater vagal tone, that is higher heart rate variability, are able to exhibit a greater range of such behaviors. So higher vagal tone, higher HRV, increased emotional regulation, increased social functioning, all of these kinds of things. So that means you have higher levels of interoceptive awareness because of mindful movement and things like this. You're going to be able to relate to people better. And when you understand other people's facial expressions better on an unconscious level, a subconscious level, right? Because there's a lot of going on in the brain that is non-conscious. And that, if everybody has this, right? Everybody's trying to get into a flow state. Everybody has mindful movement. That's going to lead to better pro-social behaviors. This is maybe hand-wavy and crude. I don't know if I can point to like a really good empirical evidence of study to back this up. This is more speculation, right? But there's some evidence that certain cultures and people like tribes and people that do things together and practice these kinds of things together have better pro-social behaviors. This could be a reason why. Better dealing with the dam example in your Chico example, right? This could really facilitate and be a possible mechanism by which that works. Does that make sense what I just said? Pro-social behaviors.
Yeah.
Right. In my ears now.
Hey, Michael, are there any distinctions between gender when it comes to kind of mind-body connection, top down, bottom up? This is a question from Pam in the panel. Good question.
I would say they're probably, God, how do I answer this question? This is a great question. I would say there may be sexually dimorphic differences, not so much gender differences. I'm gonna make a distinction between sex and gender here, biological sex and gender being socially constructed. Mm-hmm. Just let me start off with that claim, whether people agree or disagree with that claim. Having said that, there are differences in male and female brains. For example, female brains tend to be more functionally connected between hemispheres, whereas male brains tend to be more functionally connected within each hemisphere. Does this have any import into embodied cognition and flow states and these kinds of things? I think that question is still out, right? Does that have any import into like cognitive performance? No, not in my view. So making that leap, I think, is wrong. But there are differences, right? There are clear differences. Like I'll give you an example. A study came out showing there's a region of the brain deep inside the brain, right in deep here inside the brain called the stria terminalis. There's this nucleus called the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, and it's sexually dimorphic. That is, it's different in female versus male brains. There's a different quantity and quality of neurons. And I don't want to get too controversial, but male to female transgender or transsexuals, that is people who are born male but then transfer to female, they're males, right? But they're born with the female brain area of the stria terminalis rather than the male area. Whether that has any causal effect on this is completely another area. But there are cognitive differences in certain sense. But when I say cognitive, I really qualify that answer. So I don't know if I'm making sense here, but does it have any import into doing emotional scans, possibly with hormonal differences, the way the amygdala, the way the hypothalamus is between different sexes? Yes, but whether those translate into like you can be more optimal than me, or no, I would say probably not. No, there's no evidence of that.
Gotcha.
And
so it's a complex answer.
I was gonna say you should be a politician because that was beautifully.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Back to intuition. One thing. So back to intuition. So people who are good judges of character are they accessing that deeper intuition?
That's a great question. I don't know.
And just we'll go like one. Have you answer this and then do a little summary and then we'll wrap. So I want to be cognizant. So.
All right. Yeah. Let me wrap. That is a great question. A great point. Yeah. Let me think about this. So people who are good judges of character. All right. See, here's how I would answer that question as a scientist. I would say, look, let's do a study. And let's have one group who claim they are good judges of the character, and then one group who claim they're not. And then we'll match that and see if that actually turns out to be true. So we can actually have some good evidence that people really are good judges of character. It's not just like, because there's a lot of cognitive biases. Yes. People count the hits and they forget the misses. This is the gambling fallacy, right? There's a lot of cognitive biases that go on in the brain that we all now know of, like psychologists know of, right? And it's about eliminating those cognitive biases to be our optimal self. So it may be a bias that people are good judges of character. If that's the case, then it would seem to me to be true that there's a better connection between the body and the brain of those people who are better judges of character. So I would agree with the statement, but I would love to go out and find whether it's really true. That's what I'm trying to say.
The evidence. So, Michael, this has been great, and I could stay with this all night long. I can geek out on this. So
Good stuff.
Again, this 30-day challenge has really been designed to, we have, week 1 was presence. This week is about connection, and thanks for clarifying. This is about connecting. Oh, I think we lost.
No, I'm good. I'm good. I gotta stand up for a second. Like, hold on.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Keep talking.
And then next week is about choice. And then the last week is on growth. And then we have kind of a couple days to wrap with. But are there any other, I know that we'll get some resources. We'll send it out with the next mail with this video as well. But if there is a bit of like one nugget, and again, I'm always cautious of asking that one thing. I know what Stephen Kotler would say to me, but if there was a nugget around a practice to really kind of hone in on that brain body self, right, as self, what would be the one practice or that practice that you would kind of recommend to just get people to get more in tune with this dynamic or this idea of embodied cognition? Is there one practice? A practice. Yeah.
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is yoga.
Yeah.
The first thing to mind is mindful movement in some way, shape, or form. But yoga. I mean, I have a whole neuro yoga workshop that I give to yoga studios on this. I don't know if I told you that, but there's so many studies coming up that show that yoga has all these effects on the structure and function of the brain, and it's this notion of embodied cognition. But one practice that people could do is, I would say, do this body scan on a daily routine. Do your emotional body scan on a daily routine. Really try and feel your heartbeat, for example, in different parts of your body. Be very cognizant of how you walk. Be cognizant of how you move, how you get into bed, how you sit down on the chair and type, what your fingers are doing. Just try and be really cognizant of the movements that your body is making, and then make them more mindful. I would say that is probably a really good connection, really good practice of understanding this embodied cognition, not the connection. I don't want to, because I started off by saying that there's no connection. So I would say that, trying to feel your heartbeat in different places, being really cognizant of how your body moves, your facial expressions, those kinds of things. You can't do that all the time, obviously, and that's a good thing for evolutionary reasons, but you want to increase that level. That's a good thing to do.
Yeah, I was listening to Michael Gervais interview Deepak Chopra last week, and he spoke a lot about this stuff. And so for those,
good.
It was really fascinating because he talked about a lot of the stuff we're talking about, but he got really deep, really fast. So this is one last piece. Would this be similar to sensory awareness, Charlotte Selver's work? Are you familiar with Charlotte Selver?
I'm not. Full transparency, I'm not familiar with Charlotte Selver's work, but I'm going to look it up. But sensory awareness, I don't know.
So Ethan, send me that data and I'll send it off to Michael, okay? But
I'll be happy to answer the question over email for the group.
Yeah, sure. So anyway, I want to say thank you, Michael. Always a pleasure. You were kind of off, and I said, working with you is like drinking an espresso because I'm so pumped up after I get done talking to you. I hope there was some good takeaways for everybody. And keep up the great work and the challenge. Next week, we're going to be talking about connection. And we're going to have some folks who are doing work in the therapy world talking about choice. So this week's connection, next week's choice. So with that, Michael, really appreciate your time. Damon.
No, my pleasure.